coming, and thank you to Professor Cook for having me here. Just by way of a little bit of introduction, I teach on Japanese and Indian modern history at Edinburgh. And I'm researching at the moment trying to look at the relationship between religion on the one hand and the side disciplines on the other, so psychotherapy, psychiatry and psychology in modern India and modern Japan. So I'm trying to think through some of the conceptual problems that involves, and I'm hoping that we can have a bit of a discussion and maybe may shed some light on it, fingers crossed. So I thought I'd start really briefly with some of the reasons why the question of spiritual as opposed to mental health is an important one for modern Japan. And I'll talk mostly about Japan and then I think get towards the UK at the end. So I think from the point of view of Japan, these things are important because they tell us a lot as historians of Japan about what Japan's process of modernization has been all about. I saw the new Godzilla film on Monday. The new one's just coming out. I think it's officially coming out tomorrow. But it reminded me that 60 years ago, the original was all about the Japanese remembering the American atomic bomb attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the Godzilla is supposed to be the atom bomb made flesh. So it reminds me that a lot of Japanese cinema and anime has tended to be about, especially after that time, about fears of forces from outside encroaching upon Japan. Sometimes it's actual military might, weapons like the atom bomb being used on Japan, but often it's the sheer brute force of Western nations, from the Japanese point of view at least, Western nations misunderstanding Japan, misunderstanding Japanese culture. This is something that I spent a fair while in Japan myself. People in Japan still worry is going to be the case, both linguistic but also for more complicated cultural reasons. And I think Godzilla really brings that back. I also saw on the same day, because I was reviewing both of them, the final anime film by Hayao Miyazaki. He's this great, he's almost the equivalent of Walt Disney in Japan. He's a really revered figure. So his final anime came out, and it shows really similar themes. Both this one and an earlier one, Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, shows similar themes to what Godzilla, I think, is worrying about, is trying to get at, which is a small community who've managed to create something good and something worthwhile, being, as it were, under threat all the time from the outside. In one of Miyazaki's anime, he talks about it as kind of a great sea of poisonous vegetation rumbling its way towards this tiny little community. And in a lot of mainstream Japanese culture, this is how Japan understands itself, both historically and now. I've got an image of that anime, which gives you an idea. It's a perfect techno-agrarian society, and this girl, Nausicaa, and her flying machine, she has to mediate between her community, Japan, as it were, and the forces of the outside world. And it's all about this, a sea of corruption coming in from outside. So these sorts of worries about the outside and outsiders go back at least to the 16th century in Japan, when Portuguese missionaries made their way into the country. And they made some quite successful conversions among relatively elite, influential parts of society. So you get, for example, the phenomenon of Christian samurai. This causes all sorts of internal political tensions in Japan, and in the end, as probably a lot of you know, foreign Christians are kicked out, and it's illegal to practice Christianity in Japan for 200 years or more afterwards. But I think it's more to do with a bigger opening up to the West in the late 19th century that Japan had, where it's forcibly brought within the orbit of Western culture, Europe and the United States in particular. And ever since that period, really 1880s, 1890s, Japan's political leaders, bureaucrats, diplomats, writers have worried about how Japan can, on the one hand, modernize herself, having seen American steamships and felt British cannon fire off their coast. They realised they needed to modernise, but to do so without westernising. This has been the kind of crucial dilemma for Japan, how to modernise without westernising. Now, if you want to achieve that, of course, you need to know what it is about Japan, if there's some essence of Japan, the culture or the soul even, which you're trying not to lose. And so from the late 19th century, really onwards, even to the present day, you have this process of writers, thinkers in Japan trying to work out what exactly is a Japanese spirit or soul, or to use a word that gets used a lot in the 20th century, a Japanese psyche. So the issue of spirit and mentality is quite linked up to very live political issues and very big cultural issues in Japan, which we'll come to now and again across the course of the presentation. I'll touch a bit on the politics of it a little bit later on, but to give you a brief idea, there are three big periods. Back in the 1890s, of course then during the Second World War, but also the intervening 70 years, the idea of there being a particularly, uniquely Japanese spirit, or a Japanese way even of experiencing the world, has been linked to a fairly aggressive kind of cultural chauvinism in Japan that really upsets people still in places like China and Korea, who remember how that spirit, the Yamato Damashi, we'll talk about in a minute, was linked up to Japanese military atrocities in those parts of the world, as well as elsewhere. Just to give you one final quick film reference, and then I'll stop talking about films, if I may, Chris, thank you very much. This has caused a lot of trouble. This is Ein no Zero, Eternal Zero, which came out last year in Japan. It's coming out in October this year in the UK. It's well worth a look. I enjoyed it, but it's been controversial because it kind of valorizes the pilots of the Zero warplanes during the Second World War, the planes which attacked Pearl Harbor, which were initially quite successful against the Chinese and the Americans, and then were involved in the kamikaze attacks. And there are right-wingers in Japan who still kind of hark back to the Japanese spirit that these sorts of machines in this period seems to symbolize. And in the media, this is still quite a popular narrative. So again, the issue of spirit can be a cultural and a political problem, as well as the more intimate sort of problem that we're going to talk about in a moment. So I think for Japan, trying to understand how spiritual and mental come together, or how they're separate, or how they matter a great deal, is very much, as I say, about Japan's modernity and how she deals with the world as it is. But it's also much broader, of course. And I think if we look at three different words, very much, which have to do with spirit in Japan, we'll have an idea of what I mean. I'm going to concentrate mainly on the middle one. So the first one is spirit as damashi, as soul or essence or the fighting spirit. At its extreme, just before the Second World War, there was some in the Japanese military who thought we don't need to modernize the technology, our armaments, because the Japanese spirit will be enough to see us through if we end up in conflict with the Americans. The second one, much more complicated, is seishin, which can mean spirit, heart, emotions, or mental activity. It's been used, I'll talk a little bit more in a second about how it's been used in different ways, but this is the one which becomes quite popular in the late 19th century. And it gets taken up by psychiatry, psychotherapy, but also by religious and spiritual movements. And it's had this, I think, this kind of crucial ambiguity about it, which has been very, very useful in Japan. So we'll come back and talk about seishin in a minute. One final thing to say about it, I think it's probably the closest to our own word from Greek and Latin, psyche. But I think the difference between psyche and seishin is that whereas psyche, I think, generally has secular connotations now. And if you end up in a conversation, Chris will know better than I do, but if you end up in a conversation where the religious and the secular, or the religious and the medical are being talked about in terms of an individual problem, for example, if someone says it's all about psychology, or it is psychological, or just psychological, that tends to be a way of shifting the conversation away from religious or spiritual territory. Whereas in Japan, to talk about seishin doesn't actually necessarily have that effect. It makes it quite a powerful concept. On the left, the kanji is all about energy or purity, but on the right, that's the kanji for God, kami, so God or mind or spirit. Again, even just that right-hand side kanji for seishin is quite a usefully ambiguous one, but I think it's quite important. And then the final one, spiritual, the way it's written there on the left is from a syllabary called Katakana, and it's literally spiritual. So it's taken from American English, from New Thought. But that one also has all its own connotations. But it's mainly the middle one, seishin, that I think I want to talk about. So to give you an idea of how seishin gets used, I've got a different slide that will show you the first part. This is in medicine. So seishin igaku is medicine of the seishin, so medicine of the mind or soul. This is the word used for psychiatry in Japanese. Seishin bunseki is analysis, analysing the seishin. This got taken up very early in the Freudian era as a way of translating psychoanalysis. And then seishin ryoho, which is therapy of the seishin. This was taken up by psychiatrists to describe different forms of psychotherapy used in psychiatric contexts. But for psychological therapy, for clinical psychologists, they went for something entirely different, shinri ryoho. Shinri really means the reasons of the heart. And so you could say, unless you're being picky about it, you could say it's almost a, not exactly a meaningless choice, but it could have gone either way. It's actually because Japan's psychologists wanted to differentiate themselves from the psychiatrists, which is still a sort of a battle ongoing in Japan, the reason why they chose these things. But the fact that within mainstream psychiatry, Seishin, Igaku, Bunseki, and Ryoho are there makes it an interesting and, as I say, quite ambiguous world to be in. But to give you one more sense of the ambiguity here, there's a next slide which shows you how Seishin is used outside of medicine. You have Seishin Shugi, which is spiritualism of the mid-late Victorian, Edwardian eras in the West. Seishin Kai, which is the spiritual world, is quite close to the New Age movement in Japan. Slightly different, but essentially the same period and with the same kind of anti-religious, anti-authoritarian streaks to it, I think. And then Seishin Sekai, the inner world. This again is almost like our inner world. It's a kind of really nice general term if you don't really want to be specifying too heavily whether you're working in a scientific, psychiatric, medical, whatever kind of paradigm. But the fact, most of these in Japan now, in popular media and in the bookstores and on the internet, most of these words mean what we would think of in terms of being the crossover between religion and spirituality. They're not particularly medical, but it is the same word. So this crossover is key, and I think rather interesting in Japan. We're going to have a little look in a minute about how this comes about and how it might help us look, perhaps, at the UK situation when it comes to the spiritual and mental. So that's it for the Japanese lessons. The reason why I go through it is because it's a useful background, to what I'm hoping to talk about now. And also I found that, now that I'm trying to work on the relationship between religion and the side disciplines generally, to look at how big issues in the coming together of those two disciplines about meaning, about what is out there, about what a human person, or who a human person is, to try and get some clarity on those. To watch a culture like Japan go through a rapid period of change where they're thinking through these problems, as it were, out loud, in a very condensed way, I found actually quite useful. So this is an experiment, I suppose, this paper, to see whether it's useful more broadly. I'm guessing that most of you aren't particularly interested just in Japan for Japan's sake. So I suppose usually where we would start, if we were comparing the UK and Japan, it's a bit hackneyed, but it can be quite useful, is to start with the observation that you have here two island nations whose mentalities or psyche are formed partly by being a small island off the coast of a large and very influential continent, mainland China, mainland Asia, and Europe. I suppose with the European elections coming up in a week's time, that's maybe a useful link to make. But if we move on from that, I think you can see that there are two or three things in particular about Japan's experience, which I'm going to focus on, just two or three, which hopefully bring us back to the UK experience, or religion and side disciplines, this uncertain relationship they seem to be gathering in recent times, hopefully help us understand what might be going on in the UK, the US, and elsewhere. What I'm going to do is, after talking about the Japanese situation, I'm going to use the concept of orientations, which I've laid out on a slide here. The reason being that I've discovered in the Japanese situation, maybe this is true more broadly, is that when you're trying to look at controversies which involve religion and side disciplines, it's not just about the explicit claims that people make, sometimes quite forcefully in our religion atheism debates in the UK, but it's also about the assumptions at work below, beneath or behind what they're actually saying. And these are some of the orientations or assumptions that I think are quite interesting. And I'll really briefly run through them, but this will be what I'll come back to at the end. So the question of what can and can't be said, what language can and can't usefully do in terms of capturing someone's experience of the world, or capturing the way the world is. I think Japan looks at that question in a particular way, which makes it quite interesting. Then when you move on to what language can do, the role of language, the different potential roles it might be playing, and the possibility of confusion amongst people between which of those roles it's playing at any given time, when a religious leader speaks or when an influential philosopher or psychiatrist writes. So the literal identification of something substantive as opposed to a hint or an exaltation or something more existential, an existential kind of commentary, or of course metaphor and allegory. And the last two, I think I'll leave until the end because it'll be a bit clearer on the basis of what I'm about to say. So in the Japanese situation, sorry to have so many slides. Oh, this was another thing. Some of what I'm going to say about Japan comes from a book that's coming out in September, which if you're interested in religion and psychotherapy might be interested in. I've edited together with a couple of my colleagues in Japan, and Rutledge, I suppose, will more or less oblige me to mention it to you. And some of it comes from there, some of it's about early thoughts on a book that I'm hoping to start over the summer. So they may be a bit ragged, and I have no real training in specialism in philosophy or religious studies, so this is where hopefully you'll be able to pull me up on a few things. So, yeah, about Japan, I'll just look at 3 things only. I don't want to crowd out the conversation too much. Just 3 things on the Japanese modern situation, and then we'll come to this comparison with the UK. So, part of this debate between the spiritual and the mental in Japan, I think, is about personhood in the modern era, what it means to be a person. And there are 3 particular areas where this becomes a very big debate. Really thinking about the end of the 19th century and the early couple of decades of the 20th century. And it's a bit vague as it is up there. I'll be explaining each one, so please don't worry about that. First of all, the person as flesh and bones. The new government in Tokyo, after opening up to the West, wanted really to replace Japanese medicine, which was influenced by Chinese medicine, with Western medicine as quickly as possible. It seemed that Western medicine was linked to a theory of the anatomy that was empirically indisputable, whereas any amount, even a relatively small amount of dissection or autopsy would suggest quite serious flaws with some parts of Japanese medicine as it had previously been practiced. It also seemed that Western medicine was linked to the vigour and the success of European nations, so medicine and also diet. The Japanese thought, the kind of social Darwinism of the time, they thought they really need to be catching up with the West, so diet, even intermarriage, was considered to be quite important. Shall I take a break?
No, it's fine. If no one's moving around, it thinks there's no one here, so it turns the lights.
Oh, right! Like a seance for me. Okay. Yeah, so one of the reasons why Western medicine was considered to be what the Japanese had now to engage themselves with was because Europeans seemed to be so successful, partly off the back of an empirical tradition, partly off the back of using a certain kind of medicine, treating the body in a certain kind of way, eating in a certain kind of way, etc. So Japanese medicine was being gradually squeezed off to one side. And it's that professionalization of Western-style medicine in Japan which is really important for the background of Seishin, because psychiatry comes in off the back of this idea that in all sorts of ways Western medicine is fundamentally superior. Japanese medicine really, Kampo as it's called, has to really struggle for its own place here. But what's interesting is the biological anatomical model of personhood, that we're sort of fundamentally flesh, didn't immediately take over for everyone in Japan, I think for 2 reasons. Firstly, evidence suggests that most Japanese people were quite pragmatic about healthcare. They weren't interested purely or even primarily in whatever empirical evidence there might be or not be for certain drugs or therapies or forms of surgery. Also, Western-style doctors were quite expensive in this period. Most people preferred folk healers, religious healers, Kampo doctors, these sorts of things, rather than employ a Western medic. So the way that people conceived of themselves, their bodies, their personhood, doesn't change overnight just because the government says that we should sponsor Western medicine. A second thing, I think, alongside this pragmatism, was that people, I don't think in Japan at this period, from what I've read, what I've worked on, didn't really look to the body, their own bodies, for ultimate explanations about who they were. They didn't see themselves as being most fundamentally about the body. So if we extend our discussion of medicine to include psychiatry, for example, we find that for the preceding 200 years or so of relative peace in Japan, some aspects of Japanese medicine, including dealing with emotion-related disorders, this is before the big opening up to the West, had been linked less with the body and more to a moral vision of the world. So prominent doctors in Tokyo, for example, were known for linking depression, which is utsubyo is the word now used in Japan, to indolence, to laziness, and to the lack of respect for your ancestors amongst a privileged, quite wealthy peacetime population who weren't having to go out and fight or worry about whether they were going to get a meal the next day. So one of my colleagues in Japan, Keiko Daidoji, has done a bit of work on these doctors, and there's a PowerPoint just to show an illustration of an encounter with a doctor in Japan from this period, the early 1800s. She came across a really interesting account that gives us an idea of how Japanese people were maybe thinking here, or certainly relatively wealthy urbanites. A doctor by the name of Wada Tokaku, who said that his patients' low moods, what we would think about as being depression, bedbound with depression, were the result of what he called ki restraint. So ki comes from the same idea in Chinese medicine as qi, which is the idea that you have energy flowing around your body. His idea was that certain conditions are making that ki frustrated. It can't flow with the vigour that it might usually flow and get into all the places that it might usually get into. He called that ki restraint. He said that was what was causing the low mood. But he thought what was causing the key restraint wasn't something about the body, but it was a moral failure. It was a failure of people's behaviour. And he pioneered, as early as the 1820s, a form of talking therapy, an early form of talking therapy based on this. And my colleague managed to find a transcript of a brief transcript of part of his therapy session. This is therapy in Japan from the 1820s. He was visiting a woman who had been in bed for 2 years with extreme depression after the last of 8 children died in childhood. So she'd lost all 8 of her children by this point. And these were his kindly words that he had for her. He said, "Stop wailing and stop moaning, you fool and idiot. A problem like yours never happens to those who have to earn their daily rice. If you were to ask me about the cause of your disease, I would say it's nothing but smugness. You've completely forgotten that you are indebted to your ancestors." Now, whether you find that a useful form of talking therapy, kind of really abrupt shock therapy, the point was that he was linking the cause of this to morals, to behaviour, and to a certain worldview. Anatomy was off to the side. If you can use anatomy as part of that moral explanation, that's great, but anatomy isn't what's fundamental. And I think that sense, that ethic carries through to the modern era in Japan. The reason I'm giving you an idea then of all this is that I think therapy and the way that mental illness was being thought about here has to do with how people contextualise their illness, how they understand their illness. And here you can maybe use that distinction between illness and disease, which is disease is the pathology, is the conditions of the body, and illness is that plus the way the patient experiences it in terms of pain, in terms of rationalising, etc. So we'll come back to that, because I think, as I say, that comes into the modern period. But the second dimension of personhood, that I wanted to talk about is the idea of flourishing. I think this is really important, again, from the early modern into the modern era in Japan, and later on we'll see how it affects possibly the UK situation. So basically strongly held convictions about what human flourishing entails seem to remain intact all the way into the modern period in Japan, and what forward-looking thinkers in the worlds of medicine, philosophy and religion in Japan were trying to do was to connect up these convictions about what it means to flourish as a human person with new ideas about anatomy, about physics and chemistry as they came into Japan. There was a really strong ethic basically of what in Japan, the English word for it, what in Japan is called self-cultivation. It's a really broad term in Japan. It covers what we might think about as being religion, ethics, philosophy, art, education and therapy, all rolled into one. It's all about an individual's development via their relationships over the course of a lifetime. And self-cultivation was seen as being the ultimate rationale in life. And so when it comes to thinking about mental wellness and mental illness, self-cultivation, these sorts of projects, are the standard by which people imagine health and illness to a large extent. To give you an idea about how this works and how anatomy and the value, as it were, of pure explanations scientifically or physiologically comes second to these sorts of things, talk very, very briefly about a Buddhist monk called Haratanzan, a Zen Buddhist monk working in Tokyo. He's teaching at Tokyo University in the late 19th century. He was interested in how people can have their distress relieved and how they can acquire stability of mind. This is obviously a big theme for Buddhism, for Zen Buddhism in particular, but also for this ethic of self-cultivation. For him, that was the basic value. And he was interested in how you can mix Chinese medicine, Western medicine, and even Taoism, Tao-style medicine, together to show via the body how you can acquire the stability of mind. But showing via the body was just a means to an end again for him. And it's illustrated here on the next slide. This was his idea, and I'll be very brief because it's quite a complicated idea. What he basically said is that our anatomy is a matter of fluids flowing around the body, in particular in the brain and the spinal cord. And he had the idea that the fluid that flows in your brain and your spinal cord are basically separate. And if you can stop them mixing, and the fluid that flows around your brain alone can be kept to itself, which is its original state, that will be what in Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, is known as original enlightenment. The conviction for the part of Japanese Buddhism that he came from was that everybody already possesses, as it were, the Buddha nature, the Buddha mind. Everyone is already enlightened, but various things crop up in life that obscure that. And he thought his emerging knowledge of anatomy, not quite perfect as you can see, was that that perfect Buddha mind is physically present in your brain as fluid that ought not to be mixed up with fluid anywhere else in your body. And so he came up with lots of exercises, ways of sitting, that would help you to redirect flow of fluid around your body so that you could maintain the fluid that should be in your brain only in your brain, sort of uncontaminated and unmixed. And he wrote very, slightly pompously about how he risked his life on 3 occasions, sitting for long periods, trying these exercises that would separate out the fluids in his body. Importantly, what he managed to do was to set off a real consumer craze in Japan in the late 19th, particularly the early 20th centuries, where real doctors, quacks, not so real doctors, and people sporting all sorts of dodgy qualifications would try to create exercises that they would either teach people to do, they would come to the doctor's house in a group and learn it, or the big fad, once the postal system got going, was that you could do this by mail. The teacher would send you exercises to do, you would then report back by letter, and you could have a correspondence on that basis. These were called mind cure therapies, and the earliest use of a word like seishin in popular culture, as I talked about earlier on, a mixture of spiritual and mental, was for these mind cure therapies that were based on a theory of either fluid or energy in your mind that you could somehow redirect and make it do what you wanted. I think what that shows is that people maintained what I call a value orientation. Primarily, their idea in life of themselves and of what a good life would involve is not to do with a hard core of hard science, of explaining the world, etc. It's more about what is a good way to live, how ought you to relate to others, how ought you to develop over the course of a life. This was what life most fundamentally meant for people. But that if you can bring in the latest scientific or medical explanations and somehow make that work with the values that you had in life, then so much the better. So people would be really interested if it turned out that what they valued in life and the way they were trying to achieve it just happened to chime with the latest discoveries in physics or hydraulics or chemistry or whatever. So some of these consumer courses by Post tried to blend the two. They appealed to this value orientation and they appealed to this other orientation, which is that people wanted to have some idea about how the world worked. But what I would argue, what I seem to see happening in Japan, colleagues talk about this quite a lot, is that the value orientation remains primary. People don't want to know how the world works just for the sake of knowing how the world works. There would almost be no meaning, that wouldn't, as it were, be true to them. It's the value orientation as being the most important thing. And I'll try and clarify that a bit when we get to the end in a moment. But one other figure who's really popular in Japan at this point, there may well be parallels, by the way, for the UK, I'm sure there are, but I don't know the UK situation so well, is a hypnotist, this is the next slide, called Kuwabara Toshiro, who was the first to really sell huge numbers of books for a practice that he called Seishin Reido Jutsu. And you can see, depending on how good your visual memory is, the Seishin appears there in the title of his book from when I was briefly explaining it a moment ago. So Seishin Reido Jutsu means excellent movement of the mind or spirit. He wrote this in 3 volumes, and he shifted enormous quantities of this book, because what he was doing was he was giving people this value orientation about achieving peace, harmonizing family relationships, which were under a lot of strain in Japan at this point. Lots of people moving to the cities in new forms of work. Very hard to have the same kind of family relationships people had enjoyed a generation before. But what he did was to link it with Buddhist ideas about the mind, and also with these kind of emerging ideas about the mind, that it's really all about energy in a literal sense, traveling around the body and around the mind. He gave people the value orientation, he gave them some traditional Buddhism, and he also gave them what he claimed were the latest findings in science, both in the West and in Japan. And this made him an extremely popular figure. I think the popularity of his books suggests that this really appealed to the mix of feelings that educated people in Japan had at this point, in terms of how they wanted to explain to themselves the spiritual and the mental. So just one final form before we talk about how this might relate to the UK, and that's authority. So what I mean by, having talked about the flesh and these ideas about flourishing, we talked a little bit about authority already, because it's the authority of the market, as it were. The fact that Kuwabara Toshiro can find a publisher willing to support him, or newspapers willing to advertise his stuff, suggests that what consumers in Japan are prepared to spend a lot of money on, or spend a lot of time on, helps to drive the way that ideas about seishin, whether it's mental or spiritual, whether it's literally to do with energy flows around the body or not, helps to drive these general understandings for a generation later. So it isn't purely upon what experimental evidence turns up, on what Western therapies might claim. It can be largely on the authority, as it were, of the market, on what people are prepared to buy and what people are prepared to believe, to, as it were, buy into. I think that's one form of authority that's really influential in Japan then, and it still is now. But there are two other sorts that I think are important. One is emerging professional authority. What Japan did when it opened up to the West from the 1870s, 1880s onwards, very quickly established new imperial universities, and it would get German, French, British, American experts over to Japan to train the first generation of physicists, of shipbuilders, of chemists, of doctors, of historians, anything you care to name. Japan had enormous, fully functional universities, actually more or less within a generation of this opening up to the West. These universities become very, very important as not just centres of excellence, but centres of huge influence, both on the government. They have direct lines to government bureaucracy and to politicians, and also to the media. So depending on what universities champion in terms of ideas about psychiatry, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, and what they choose not to champion, notions of seishin, and what seishin is, and what spiritual versus mental is, can be changed almost overnight in Japan. Particularly professors at Tokyo University have absolutely enormous influence. And if you were to run down a list of government politicians and bureaucrats from the 1920s and 30s, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who didn't go to Tokyo University. That was your route into politics and government service. So directly through their students, also through the kudos they carry in the media, university professors had a huge amount of influence for this sort of period. The other kind of influence is, of course, the government itself. Japan's government in this period, not quite yet the authoritarian government that it became in the 30s and 40s, but it was a government that really wanted to change the way the population thought in quite detailed and in quite intimate ways. I think it's hard for us to recreate the sense of embarrassment that Japan's first governments had in the 1870s and 80s at the disparity between what was happening in Japan in terms of the level of technology, culture, discovery, thought, and what they thought was happening in the West. I mean, they travelled around Europe and North America to see what was going on. They were hugely embarrassed, and they were trying as quickly as possible to change people's behaviour. And this ended up influencing, as we'll see, quite a profound way how people thought about spiritual and mental. And the way that happened is quite a colourful character. He's the last person I'll talk about before, as a kind of conclusion, I start thinking about the UK and Japan together. A very colourful character called Inoue Enryo. I think he's a brilliant sign of his times, and it's possible to exaggerate that, to really want someone to personify their times, but I think he is very useful. He was born into a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist family. He was destined to become a Buddhist priest, to take over the temple of his family, as happened in Japan still at this point. But he gave that up to study at, of course, Tokyo University. He studied philosophy there in the late 19th century. And what's interesting about him is that his career, via his career, he becomes a channel through which the kinds of social and political pressures that I'm talking about really start to influence people's thinking in a big way about spirituality and mental health. Also about what we sometimes loosely call the supernatural. So he becomes a really interesting person for shifting people's ways of thinking here. Firstly, he comes under government influence. One of the things the Japanese government wanted to do in this period was to stop people believing in ghosts or demons or goblins or animal spirits. This had been, for large parts of Japan, still quite a live issue in folk religion. Mental illness, what we would call mental illness, was in most parts of Japan viewed as things like spirit possession, particularly fox possession. And there are still examples of that in rural Japan into the middle and late 20th century. The government basically thought that to have a population that thinks in that way, that believes literally in ghouls and goblins, is embarrassing. How can you possibly have a modern country with scientists, military personnel, teachers and all the rest, governors, who believe things about the world like that? So they were trying to actually stamp this out, and they enlisted psychiatrists to try to do this. They said, as psychiatrists, you need to explain to people via hospitals, clinics, popular publications, that when people have feelings like this, it's all about the body. or it's all about psychology. We need to replace the language of possession, of ghosts, of paranoia, with the language of modern medicine. Psychiatrists were officially supposed to go out into the countryside and spread, as it were, the good medical news. And they were supposed to write up for the government reports of what people were really believing and what they were practicing as a way of getting them to be free of these spirits. And the government, thanks to the government, actually have really good records of people being made, for example, to stand in the freezing cold under huge waterfalls just outside temples to purify them of the spirits. Some of these psychiatrists are actually quite open-minded for their time. They would say, well, actually, there's an element of these therapies that actually works. The rationale, for example, for a water bath, there's hydrotherapy, of course, in Europe. The rationale is faulty. The reason they think is kind of a purification of spirits, but the effect on the body is quite good and is quite real. So some psychiatrists are quite open-minded, but the government were adamant that believing in these sorts of things, in the supernatural in general, was completely out of the window now. A second pressure they put via the government was that Buddhism ought to take a back seat. This is ironic because in Europe at the same time and in the West, there's briefly a worry that Buddhism is going to completely replace Christianity, because it seems to be by far the more rational religion, more in line with the latest discoveries in physics, more in line with evolutionary theory. Of course, as we know, it's not that simple, and in large parts Christianity didn't at all have a problem with evolutionary theory. But nevertheless, Buddhism was making great strides, and some people were quite worried about it. But in Japan, it was the opposite. The Japanese government said, actually, it's the Buddhists, the Buddhist temples, the Buddhist leaders who've been holding us back. They've kind of milked our economy for all this tax money for building fantastic statues and renovating their temples, and they've told people to worry about hungry ghosts, to worry about however many circles of hell. They've been holding us back economically and psychologically for generations. And so when someone like Inoue comes to university and he's looking for an audience for his philosophical ideas, he's trying to, I suppose, get in line with this government agenda. And the way that he does it helps to really re-establish the way people think about the spiritual and the mental. So first of all, what he does is he publishes a book which is literally a list of all the different sorts of ghosts, goblins, ghouls and monsters in which Japanese people ought no longer to believe. And he more or less says these sorts of beliefs equal these kinds of psychological problems, because he studied the emerging psychological psychotherapeutic theories during his time at university. So he tried to make that nice and clear. What he also did was he said, actually, there are elements of Buddhism which are pure superstition and which we should get rid of. But he came up with a useful theory of Buddhism, which is that to get to the true form of Buddhism, you don't need to go back to the Buddha. Lots of scholarly theories in the West held that to get to the truest form of Christianity or Buddhism, you go back to the texts, you go back to the original writers, with as much kind of oral folk memory as possible, to get rid of later accretions and superstitions. Inoue said actually that's the bad way of doing it. What Japan has done, what Japan is in the process of doing now, is developing Buddhism. It's a progression in Buddhism. So Japanese Buddhism in the 1890s, when Inoue was responsible for helping to reform it, is actually the closest to the genius of Buddhism that any country or culture in the world has ever come. And he used to write quite offensive articles about parts of Southeast Asia and India and say, look how they live there. How can you imagine that they would possibly have a reliable idea about what Buddhism is? So he managed to mix this list of monsters, writing against them, and this idea that Buddhism needs to modernize itself together to say that actually Buddhism and psychotherapy are two sides of the same coin. This was the great theory that he came up with and he tried to develop. So he coined the term Seishin Ryoho, literally psychotherapy, as we said earlier on, to be a useful means for everybody, whether you have an obvious mental or emotional condition or not. Everybody should be interested in Seishin Ryoho. Because by undergoing psychotherapy, you can find out which parts of your thinking, which parts of your worldview, which parts of your inner life, as it were, are pathological, are really elements of emotional or psychological distress, and we have terminology for that, he would say, and which elements are actually getting you more towards what he would regard as the divine. So psychotherapy as a tool for discernment was something that he was thinking about. But he went further and he would say that Buddhism itself is a form of psychotherapy. All the, as it were, concrete beliefs and personages of Buddhism are just metaphors and allegories that the gumin, the ordinary people about whom he was quite offensive in Japan, have sort of made into deities as a kind of idolatry. But actually Buddhism and psychotherapy are saying essentially the same thing. And he came up with a series of practices that you could do by yourself or in groups that would get you to that kind of discernment. And he was the one who really popularized Seishin Ryoho as a result. So he appears, bizarrely, he appears with great presence in histories of Buddhism, but also in histories of psychiatry in Japan as being a really central figure. And I think he gets us to our final slide, if that's all right, just for the last 2 or 3 minutes. This is where I was hoping to open the conversation up to some of these thoughts about orientations and about assumptions. So what I'll do just briefly for 3 or 4 minutes is talk about how I think this operated in Japan at the time that I'm thinking of, and then maybe we can broaden it out to think about the UK. Because one of the things I've been discovering early on in this work about how religion and the side disciplines come together in the UK is that I would have hoped, you might hope, that by bringing them into conversation, you might end up with greater clarity about what religion is or does on the one hand, and what psychotherapy, psychiatry, and psychology on the other hand are or do. But in fact, I think there can often be kind of a great deal of confusion in terms of the use of language between the two. Maybe it's legitimate and useful confusion and overlap, I'm not sure. But looking at the Japanese case helps us, I think, at least be more self-conscious in thinking through these problems. So first of all, what can and can't be said. A big difference in the Japanese situation and the UK one, certainly with a Christian background, is this. In Japan, there's no tradition of a deity for which it is personal in the sense that there's a revelation of himself or herself to human beings. There's no sense of a self-revelation of the divine, which means there's no reason why human cognition and human language ought necessarily to be able to capture the way the world is accurately. So they don't, as it were, have that worry, but it means they're also what we might call agnostic about what language can really do for us. When we're trying to think about religion and the side disciplines side by side, we need to hold language, as it were, quite lightly, because it can only go so far. This adds, I think, a particular taste to Japanese agnosticism. It isn't quite the same thing, doesn't have the same roots as agnosticism in the UK. But a lot of Japanese people, if you ask them, will point to this phrase at the bottom, which is shaka no muki, which means effectively Buddha was silent on that question. They love to remind us, especially Westerners, when we start talking about this kind of thing, that on certain major questions, the Buddha never gave an answer. Or he said, there's no point answering that question. You know, the great story about if you've got an arrow thrust into your chest, are you going to worry about what the arrow is made from, who made it, where it came from? Are you going to start cognizing, as it were, about that? Or are you going to try and pull it out? So they would love to go back to that. They would say, some of these things language just can't cope with. And I think that's harder in the West to get an idea of, certainly when we're trying to compare religion and side disciplines. Also thinking about what language at any point is supposed to do in any case. Is it supposed to be literally identifying something actual and substantive? And I think both in religion and also in psychiatric diagnosis, for example, we often do, certainly in popular discourse, end up in a situation where we think, because we have a word for that, or a name for that condition, for example, it must be some discrete existing pathology. It must be actually going on physically in the body, somehow matching up with the way that we're describing it. So psychiatric diagnoses not being useful terms that help to give you a broad idea about the likely course or outcome of your particular condition, but actually being a discrete entity. And I think we often tend to assume that. And in the Japanese context, maybe that helps to reorient our thinking a little bit. All they would say is the role of language sometimes just to hint at or exhort people, or to make an existential declaration. To give you a really simple and very brief example of this, there's a Japanese prayer called the Nembutsu, which is Namu Amida Butsu, which is literally just calling on the name of Amida Buddha. It's that very, very short phrase, which in some sects of Japanese Buddhism people will use as their basic phrase. Anyway, I would say, well, what's going on when someone says this prayer in Nembutsu? For some Japanese who we regard as silly, ignorant people, it's calling on the name of a really existing personage by the name of Amida Buddha, a celestial Buddha, who is then going to help you out, welcome you into the Pure Land. But he said, you know, to think about it that way, we really need to move on from. What you're doing instead, when you say this phrase, is you're generating, exercising a sense of faith in the absolute. Exercising in two senses. Exercising as you might exercise your right for something. So you're expressing something that you already have, this kind of faith in the absolute you already have. Or exercising in the sense of helping to build it up, like a muscle. You're helping to develop your faith in the absolute. Via this idea of a kind of a human anthropomorphic Amida Buddha, but not really expecting that such a thing or a person actually exists. So you go via this idea in order to strengthen your faith in the absolute, and strengthen generally in terms of self-cultivation. So we said language being used existentially is what we have to get used to as Japanese. And metaphor and allegory I don't really need to explain, because I suppose that's quite obvious. But as a very last comment, just to come back to value versus explanation, I'm sorry it's quite dense with these terms. What I would say for the Japanese period that I've looked at, which I think was a revelation for me when I was finding out about it, is that people were interested primarily in understanding, as it were, life in terms of what they thought they ought to become, who they thought they ought to become, how they thought their relationships to each other and to the absolute ought to develop. And less so in terms of this, as it were, explanation orientation, what goes on in the body, in terms of psychiatry, in terms of medicine, in terms of psychotherapy. If you can have a nice explanatory model and understanding, like Haratanzan did with his fluid theory, for example, that's all very well, but it's the value orientation that matters the most. And I still think that's the case today. People, for example, getting involved in past life therapy in Japan, when they're interviewed, they say, well, I don't know if I've really had past lives or not, but past life therapy has so fundamentally enriched, even revolutionized the way I experience the world moment to moment, that it's a valid form of therapy, as far as I'm concerned. Which I think is, on the one hand, is wonderful, but on the other hand, it raises the question, and this is the very last thing I've promised, which came up in the Indian Psychiatry Journal recently, which said there are two sorts of religious ideas. There are those that help people feel better and flourish, and there are those that are superstitious, and we need to get rid of. So the idea that religion is involved in any kind of explanatory model of reality to which you might need to commit yourself seems to be slightly receding, and instead it's much more in terms of how can religion help you lead a better or a more flourishing life, which may be not an entirely positive direction of travel. Anyway, I shall leave it at that.
Thank you.